So we're on 50B1 at Gufa. If in the art scroll, that would be the left hand, the left column on 50B1. So we're at an Amud behind, because today's daf is Nun Aleph. So let's begin. Okay, we begin again. Gufa. We just learned. Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar had an inquiry. L'divrei ha'oima par Yomi Kippur and Karban Yachid. The par that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur, the atonement, the par chatos, the atonement par that he brings, bull that he brings. According to the Man Yoma, that says it is a private offering. It's a private offering. Oisid Tamura or Ein Oisid Tamura? Can it affect the Tamura or not? And again, a Tamura is if another animal was designated instead of this one. It got lost momentarily or whatever it was, and another animal is then by the owner. And what the definition of the owner is we're going to get to in a minute. But by the owner, we get by the owner. He assigns another animal onto this offering. Does that assignment, is it effective? Is it not? So pray to Gemara. What is Rabbi Elazar asking? Because even if you're going to say the Kohen Gadol's par chatas, par Yom Kippur, his bull for Yom Kippur is a private offering. Nonetheless, we know that all the other Kahanim are sort of attached to it, because he says, Ano Hashem, Chatosi Avisi Pshaiti Levanecha, Pli Ani Ubesi Ubnei Aaron Ubnei Aaron Abdul Shefa. In other words, and my fellow Kahanim. So he's having in mind not just himself and his own household, but his fellow Kahanim. So his fellow Kahanim are clearly on this animal for atonement, which makes them essentially, logically, partners in the animal. And we already learned before that partners cannot affect a tamura. Partners cannot go ahead and create a second animal in place on top of this first one to create tamura. That was one of the things, because it doesn't have an individual ownership, it has a many ownership. So therefore, that can't be what Rabbi Elazar seems to be inquiring about, because the answer to that is simple. If there are partners, by definition, they can't be tamura. So the Gemara explains like this: do we look at the situation and we look at the person who's creating, who consecrated the offering, who took this animal and made it holy? Or do we go after the status of who's getting atonement from it? In other words, if we look at the one who's consecrating it, well, then it's a Karban Yachid. It's a private offering, because the Kohen Gadol is the only one who consecrated this animal. On the other hand, if we say that the owner is in fact the ones who are getting atonement, well, then there's a bunch of partners, because the entire Shevet, all the Kahanim are getting atonement. So, and then that one, and if it's not a private, therefore it's a partnership cannot affect Tamura. Says the Gemara, that can't be the question of his inquiry. An inquiry means he does not know that Rabbi Elazar had a question, but that can't be. Pshita, the boss of Mischaper Azlina. It's obvious, it's partial that of course you're going after the ones after we're saying that the ownership is based upon who's getting atonement, because that's the whole purpose why you're bringing it in the first place. And the atonement means that there's a bunch of people on it, all the Kahanim, making it a partnership. The Omer of Rabbi Yochanan, concerning a case where one person is mechuyev to bring a carbon and a second person is kind enough to donate something on behalf of the other person. So Ruvain needs to bring a carbon and Shimon donates the animal. That Ruvain requires, so that means there seems to be two different people on this animal. There's Shimon, who got the kindness of his the kindness of his nature, goes ahead and consecrates an animal on behalf of Ruvain, but it's Ruvain that gets the atonement. So the Gemara says, Hamadish Moisef Chalayachamish, the one who consecrates, Shimon, who consecrates the animal on behalf of Ruvain, if something should happen to this animal and it gets blemished, so it needs to be redeemed and another animal placed instead of it, it's on Shimon, the one who's consecrated the animal, even though he doesn't actually need the animal. But it's on him, since he got it started by consecrating the animal, he has to go ahead and redeem this animal for another one. And by rule, when you redeem, you have to add an extra fifth. You have to lay out another 20% on top of its value. That monetary reality, penalty as it were, falls onto Shimon, who consecrated the animal. On the other hand, umischaper oisaba tamura. But the recipient of the atonement, i.e. Ruvain, who actually needed the carbon for his atonement, right? Ruvain can create tamura. Because with regard to ownership of the animal, we say it goes on who's getting the atonement, not the one who consecrated it in the first place. Only do we say ownership is based on who actually required this animal, who required this atonement. That was Ruvain. And since he's the owner, he can go ahead and by definition make a tamura. But by definition, that means that ownership with regard to tamura goes after the atonement. So in the case of the par of Yom Kippur, the bull of Yom Kippur of the Kohen Gadol, even though the Kohen Gadol is the one who consecrated it, the atonement is going on the Kohen Gadol and his family and his brothers, the Kahanim. So there's a lot of partners on this animal, and partners cannot affect tamura. So that's what the Gemara over here says. That's exactly what it's saying over here. And while we're on the subject, let's just finish the brisa. If Shimon separates teruma from his produce on behalf of his friend Ruvain's produce, he gets the gratitude. He could pick which kohen he's going to give it to, etc. But what do we see from over here? That the person who gets atonement is considered the ownership vis-a-vis the power to make a tamura. Well, by definition, that means by the power of the Kohen Gadol, there's many owners because all the Kohanim are getting atonement. If that's the case, they cannot make tamura because we said we're very clear that tamura is only effective with one owner, not with partners. So what was Rabbi Elazar uncertain about? What was his inquiry? It seemed very basic. So for the Gemara, I'll tell you exactly what his uncertainty was. You're right. Clearly, ownership goes on by those who are getting atonement because they're the ones who actually needed this carbon. And this was the question that we're uncertain. Concerning the Kohen Gadol's fellow brothers, we're now on 50b2. Are they receiving atonement as established partners on this carbon, or no? Dilma de kufe mischapri, or maybe they're receiving the atonement as a side reality. Meaning, if you look at Rashi is about 15 lines before the Rashi gets wide. It's in the skinny lines. Dilma bekufe mischapri. Rashi explains it's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Oh, pretty good. 13 lines before it gets wide. Kalaima, in other words, Ein kaparosan kivua. their atonement of the rest of the Kahanim is not set in stone. Elo sofa al gav kaparas kohen gadol. It's floating on top of the atonement of the kohen gadol. Kedova, like something hafsaf al pnei amayim, like something that floats on top of water. The Eina Carbon Nikram al Shamam. The carbon is not called after their name. The carbon is called the carbon Kohen Gadol, the Par Kohen Gadol, the bull of the Kohen Gadol. It's not called the bull of the Kahanim, right? The carbon Yachidhu, and therefore it is a private carbon of just the Kohen Gadol. The Yatzaf Arbazel Mitagim Bekofim Arbazel. So in other words, the point here is the Gemara is saying this is the inquiry. Do I say, because the reality is that all the brothers of Kahanim are getting atonement, they're in essence, they're de facto partners on this animal, and if they're partners, we can't have Tamura. Or no, the truth is it is a private carbon of the Par Kohen Gadol. It's the bull of the Kohen Gadol. It happens to be that the Kohen Gadol, because he's the head of all the Kahanim, everybody's floating on his shoulders by and by. But it's not like they have any actual ownership in the animal itself. And if they don't have any ownership in the animal itself, well, then it's possible to have a tamura, a secondary animal that's designated on top of this one. So now
I thought also, when we originally learned it, didn't we learn that when he said, I don't remember, it was Chatasi or Visi or whatever, wasn't it the original one was to talk about his own kapara and then the Kohan?
Correct.
So this would be something like that it's an ancillary atonement only after he gets his own.
So the end that would seem, by the way, I thought of that too. That makes more sense. Except if you remember, we had a Gemara that said the reason why that was done was because we said, let one who achieved atonement atone for others. So he said, first the Kohen atones for himself and his house. Then he turns around and says, God, not only me, but my fellow brothers. And then afterwards, all of Klal Yisrael. So that, in other words, it's not a perfect proof. The only reason why, the truth is, theoretically, he could do it all in one shot. Ani ubeisi ubnei Aaron.
Right.
Well, we said it's the proper way to do it. To first gain your own atonement, and then try to get atonement for everybody else. I thought about the same thing. So here you got, and this, listen, you know the way you could say like this? You could almost apply it to our things. What does it mean to be a member of BJC? It doesn't mean simply to write out a check for $1,500 a year and that's it. Does that make you a member? Or does that really make you an ancillary member who just happens to benefit because there's a bunch of guys that are putting their leib v'nefesh to make sure the shul runs and has programs and has shiurim and has golf tournaments and all that? There are the hanger-ons and then there are the doers. Now the hanger-ons will tell you, what are you talking about? I'm a full-fledged member. I wrote out the check. That's what the check gets me, right? So I'm a partner in the shul. The guys who are actually doing all the work might have a different take on that thing. And the truth of the matter is that's this Gemara. Essentially, that's this Gemara. Does the one who ultimately get the benefit are considered full-fledged members? Or no, really they're ancillary, meaning you can show up, but you don't have any say on how anything runs, right? And that, of course, is what's going on. So Toshma, and you can see it in everyday life because it happens all the time. And a perfect example will be that Jerry Abramson could be in California, and on the Boku chat, they're going to send, Jerry, can you send us the menu for the truck this week? Right? All of a sudden, Jerry's the go-to guy, right? No benefit for it, right? But Jerry's the go-to guy. Jerry's the guy who gets it done. But nonetheless, in everybody else's eyes, Jerry's just one of the guys, right? In Jerry's eyes, it might be a little different, right? And that's exactly what this Gemara is saying. What is it? Right? Do we say because they get atonement, the fellow Kahanim are essentially partners? Or no, it's the Kohen Gadol. He spends his own money to buy the bull. He slaughters it. It's named after him, right? It's called the Par Kohen Gadol. They just, they float. In the words of Rashi, they're floating on the water. They're being lifted by the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol. In life, this happens a lot. We all know it does. That is a rule in fundraising. 95% of your money comes from 5% of your donors, right? The famous 80-20 rule, but in fact, in fundraising, it's the 95-5 rule. And it's true. It holds true in life. The right people are followers. There are very few leaders. That's just the way it is in life. That's the way it is. And the Gemara is saying, what does that mean in English? So says the Gemara, Toshma. There happens to be a stringency by a regular offering as opposed to a Tamura. And there is a stringency by a Tamura over a regular offering. There's a stringency with regard to an offering, because such an offering can be owned by the community, by the tzibur, as well as by a private person. And it overrides the Shabbos and the Tumah, and it could affect the Tamura, obviously as a carbon yochid, not as a carbon tzibur, but as a carbon yochid. As opposed to by Tamura, says Rashi, and this is the last Rashi right before it gets in the skinny lines, right before it gets fat. Masha'ain came bitamura. Sha tamura aina bitzibur. Tamura by definition cannot be with ownership of a community. It has to be owned privately, individually. The Eina Doiches Shabbos, and does not override the Shabbos. Why? She'ein Zamana Kavua, because its time is not set. A Tamura really doesn't even need to ever come into existence. It only came into existence because for some reason you misplaced the original animal, and so you went ahead and made a Tamura under it. But it's not set in place. And we said before, something that's not set, b'moyadoi, in its time, right, does not get to override the Shabbos. Ve'ena oisa tamura, and we have a rule that ain't tamura oisa tamura. That means if you had an original animal and then for some reason you made a tamura, a secondary animal, the secondary animal cannot make a third animal. There can't be a tamura for a tamura. The ksiv v'hayahu u'tamurasai, v'loi tamurasai. But not a tamura on a tamura. So the bottom line is there's clearly stringencies that have to do by a zevach, by a regular zevach, that are not found by a tamura. Mashake it back to the Gemara. But there is a stringency that's found by a tamura than by a zevach. Number one, that if you go ahead and you make a second animal holy in place of the first, and it happens to be that the second animal has a permanent blemish, so it'll never be good on the Mizbeach. Nonetheless, believe it or not, the Tamura goes, and we say it becomes holy, it becomes consecrated. It does become consecrated, as opposed to an animal that you want to make as a regular Zevach, that if it has a full-time mum, it never gets consecrated. It's nothing. And the Eino Yoitza L'chulen L'gizah Zolam Aved, and the animal can never be deconsecrated to the extent of being allowed to be sheared and for working. It's one of the things of a tamura without going into the whole technical reality of it. But the tamura, in its holiness, cannot be redeemed in such a way that it would then be allowed to be used, its wool to be sheared and to be able to do some work with it. It's considered a mash'ain came bezebach, as opposed to a regular all the way out into chulin, where it could be used to be sheared and to work, as opposed to a tamura. So now it says the Gemara, Hi zebach hechidam. What's the case of the ordinary offering? If you're going to say we were talking about a carbon yachid, a private one, I'll answer. Mi dachi Shabbos v'tumah. Does a private offering daicha the Shabbos or the tumah? No, ela b'tzibor. And that only happens in a community. We know tumah is hutra b'tzibor. Tumah becomes allowed in a community, or tumah is duchya b'tzibor, or tumah is daicha, is pushed off in a community. And the same thing with Shabbos. It's the carbon tamid. That's the classical case. It's a carbon tzibur that gets pushes off the Shabbos. To ela b'tzibur, then we have a problem. Mi also tamura. How does it ever make a tamura? We said before, tamura can only be affected by something that has private ownership, individual ownership, not partnership ownership. Elolab, what are we talking about here? What is this brisa, this contradictory brisa talking about? Elolab de par. We're talking about the Yom Kippur bull. And it holds that it meets all of these criteria. That in fact, it is a private carbon. It belongs to who? It belongs to the Kohen Gadol. He paid for it. It's called after his name. His fellow brothers, God, get atonement. That's only because they're floating along. They're ancillary. They just happen to, but they're standing on his shoulders. And therefore, but if it's private, how do we get to V'doiches the Shabbos Tumah? It overrides the Shabbos and the Tumah. Why? And now we're on 50b3. Why? To realize the man. Because its time is fixed. Who fixed the time? The Torah Kedosha. Hashem commanded that the Kohen Gadol bring his bull on Yom Kippur during the Avodah. So therefore, he doesn't got any choices in the matter. You don't have any choices. Which means that it therefore falls into the idea of b'moyadoi, in its time. Once the Torah says b'moyadoi, in its time, the Torah fixes that the carbon must be brought, and it must be brought at this time. There is no brera, you have no free will in this. You have to do it, right? Once you have no choices in the matter, well, then it could be daicha. The oisa tamura, but at the same time, it could affect tamura because at the end of the day, it is a privately owned carbon. The carbon yachinu, that it's a carbon yachid. So we see from here that this Tana holds that the Tana of the Yom Kippur bull, the Yom Kippur bull is considered a private offering with regard to affecting tamura. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Sheshes, no. We're not talking about the bull. We're not talking about the par at all. We're talking about Be'eloi Shal Aaron. We're dealing with Aaron's ram, the oiler ram. There is another carbon that he has to bring. He has to bring the oiler ram. Okay? That's a specific offering that he's got to bring. The oiler ram, he's got it, it's Daicha Shabbos and Tumah because it must be brought. It's fixed. It must be brought on Yom Kippur. And it could affect Tamura because it's truly a private offering because his brothers Kahanim are not in this carbon at all. The carbon oil that the Kohen Gadol has to bring from a ram, from an ayil, corresponds to essentially the ayil that was brought at the binding of Yitzchak by the Akedas Yitzchak. Yitzchak was the ayil, and then it says when Hashem stopped it, Vayar v'hine ayil achar, and there was another ayil. Everybody asks, what do you mean another ayil? There was Yitzchak isn't then actually a ram. It should have said Vayar v'hine ayil. He looked up and he saw a ram. What's ram acher? Other. But you know what the gematria of acher is? The gematria of acher happens to be the same gematria as Yitzchak. So that's how we knew ayil achar, right? It has the same gematria as Yitzchak, the same thing. So that's how we knew that this ayil was in place of Yitzchak. But the short and long of it is, this is truly a carbon yochid. It's truly fixed in place. So therefore, this is what the Bryce is talking about, and it teaches us nothing with regard to the bull of the Kohen Gadol, and it doesn't teach us whether the brothers Kahanim are merely hanger-ons or are actual partners in the behemoth, which would mean in the par, which would mean that if they are partners, we cannot affect Timurah. And the Gemara says, Halchanami Mistabra, this is much more reasonable that we're talking about the ram of Aaron than the Kohen Gadol's ram. The Isak out of the Paroi, because do you mind that we're talking about the Kohen Gadol's bull, Temura de Par, concerning the Temura of the bull, Shabbos v'Tumah hu deloy dachya ha b'chol makiv krava. Can it be said that it merely does not override the Shabbos and Tumah? But by implication, it may be offered on a weekday if Tumah is not present. In other words, what happens if it didn't fall out? If it doesn't fall out on Shabbos, right? Logically, it should be able to be brought. And if there's no there's no Tumah, it should be allowed to be brought. Ha Temura's chatasi, but the Temura is a chatas. The power of the Kohen Gadol, the bull of the Kohen Gadol is coming to atone. Which carbon comes to atone? Which offering comes to atone? The chatas. Chatas means on the aveira. Chet, the aveira, the chatas. The rule is, but Temuras chatasin or Temuras chatas lamisazla, and the rule is the Temura of a chatas goes to its death. It's not offered. So therefore, since we're talking about it is being offered, we must be talking about the ram of the Kohen Gadol and not the bull of the Kohen Gadol. So the whole question doesn't start. And for the Gemara, like, no. In fact, li'olam para. No, we are talking about the par. We are talking about the bull. And my Temura, shame Temura. We're talking about the general category of Temura, not the Temura of any specific offering. We're just simply going on and saying, we're talking about the Temura in general does not override Shabbos and the Tumah. And so that's what we're talking about over here. That's all. Says the Gemara, Hachi Zevach Nami, if that's the case, for ordinary offering that the Brisa mentions, Shem Zevach, it should be creating a reference to not just the specific Zevach, but the general statement on Zevachim, on ordinary offering. Okay? And that would mean, it doesn't mean the general offerings would say that it can be owned either by an individual or community, that sometimes it overrides the Shabbos and Tumah if it's brought out of Kizman Kavua at a fixed time, and it's owned by it's owned by the Tzibor. All right, none of these criteria exist in the general category of Temura, right? Therefore, there's no basis at all to say that the Bryce is talking about the bull of the Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol because we're bringing down Temura, and there's no need to argue. And therefore, maybe it began talking about the bull of the Kohen Gadol, but what we're talking about over here is the regular Zavachim. There's no proof one way or another to the power of the Kohen Gadol. Does the Gemara know? Shame zebach like it done. The Brisa does not mean to give us general categories of offerings. Mimai, how do I know this? Midiktani, the actual language of the Brisa is. Where the Brisa goes ahead, it says that there's a stringency by a Tamura. That it takes that Tamura takes effect even on an animal that has a permanent blemish, which would not happen by a regular offering. And it cannot be redeemed completely, and it therefore remains also remains forbidden to shear it and to work with it. The Isa kedatik my zevach shem zevach, and if you're going to tell me the price was trying to give us a broad, general category of regular zebachim, I will say to you, va'ika, so we're on today's daf, Nun Aleph Amid Aleph, 51a1. There is Bechar Umaisa. There is the Bechar and the Maisa. The Bechar is the firstborn animal that's born, and Maisa is the 10th animal that comes through the shoot. You create a shoot, you march animals, all the new animals born, and you march them through there. And the 10th one gets hit on the back. It gets like painted with a little red, and on it says, "This is Maisa." And the halacha is the cholon al balmum kavua and both the bechor and Maisa, the consecrated becomes holy, even if any of them have a permanent blemish, and the animal can never go out, can never be poida, can never be redeemed, to be allowed to be sheared and worked. And the reason for this is because a bechor is automatic. The second that animal is born as the firstborn, it automatically is holy. The 10th animal that marches through the shoot is automatically the 10th animal. Once again, when it's automatic, it's not even up to you. It happens automatically. The holiness automatically is placed on it, whether it has a blemish, whether it doesn't have a blemish. And because it's so automatically holy, you can't remove it. Hi, Daddy, how are you? We just started today's daf. Nun Aleph Amid Aleph. Okay? Nun Aleph 51a1.
Amid Aleph? Yeah.
Yes, right on the top. We just said it. So again, Bechoru Maiso, the Bechor and the Maisa, the Cholon al Balmum Kabua Vein Mevad. Because it's automatically holy, it gets born into the world holy. The Bechor, the firstborn, is automatically holy. The 10th animal that marches through the shoot is automatically the 10th animal. You're not allowed to switch. If you see that animal has a mum, has a permanent blemish, you're not allowed to switch it. It happens like this. It's again, your bechira, your free will is suspended. Whenever that happens, the rules are always different. When you as a human being don't have much choices in the matter, right? The Torah is limiting your choices. Automatically, what happens? It automatically is holy automatically, and because it's holy automatically, whether you make it holy or not has nothing to do with it. It's automatically holy. You can't take it out of its holiness in order to shear it and to and to work it. Ella shem zebach v'loy ketani. It means that the Brisa does not mean to give us a general category of a classic general category of all offerings, because not all offerings are the same. Rather, therefore, it's talking about a specific type of offering, right? So the Brisa therefore means there's a type of offering that has a greater chumrah than the general category of Tamura, and the general category of Tamura has a greater chumrah than the specific type of offering. So what are we talking about? My Shina Tamura. And what is the case of Tamura different that the Brisa does refer to the general category of Tamura, as opposed to the Zevach? Because Shem Tamura Achasi, the entire category of Tamura is one set of laws. There's no variables that have different laws. Zevach, there is an outlier, which has exceptions to the general rules. They are Zevachim, but they're automatically holy and can never be redeemed out to be worked or shared, and they become holy even if they have a permanent blemish. So now the Gemara says, Ula Rav Sheshes. So according to Rav Sheshes, who's the one who wanted to deflect that we religiously learned the Bryce that the Bryce was talking about the Kohen Gadol's Chapas bowl, and we're trying to determine whether it's a carbon yachid, and the other Kahanim are merely hanger-ons floating on top of the water, floating on top of the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol, or no, they're actually full-fledged partners, and therefore, if they're full-fledged partners, they can't make a temura of the par Kohen Gadol. But Absheshus came along and said, no, the whole Bryce is not talking about the par at all, doesn't tell us anything about the bull. Absheshus is telling us it's talking about the ayil shel Aaron HaKohen, the ayil, the ram that the Kohen Gadol brings, the ram being a carbon oilah. It's not a chatos, it's an oilah. It's definitely a private. It's only on the Kohen Gadol. It's because the Kohen Gadol is doing the avodah. The Torah says you've got to bring on Yom Kippur a oilah. He brings his own private. Everybody agrees it's a private oilah. Nonetheless, it's doicha the Shabbos and Tumah because the Torah is mechayev. The Torah says b'moyado, you must bring this ayil. You must bring this ram. And again, every time the Torah says you must, you have no choices in the thing. The rules are different. Where there is no choices, b'moyado, even if it's a carbon yachid, a private owned thing, you have it overrides the Shabbos and the Tumah. So now that's what Rav Sheshes wanted to come to say, that the Bryce is not talking about the bull, it's talking about the ram. And if it's talking about the ram, by definition, it doesn't tell us anything about the bull. So I have no idea at this moment in time whether the bull, the brothers Kahanim are considered full-fledged partners, and therefore Tamura is not possible. Or no, they're not full-fledged partners, they're merely hanger-ons. And in fact, it is the private carbon of the Kohen Gadol, and it could make a Tamura. So now, Rav Sheshes, who says the whole Bryce is not talking about the bull, it's only talking about the ram, the ayil of the Kohen Gadol, the oilah, let him say, instead of interpreting the Bryce as dealing with Aaron's oilah ram, i.e. the ram of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, look me b'Pesach, he should say it's dealing with Pesach, the carbon Pesach. Now we know something about the carbon Pesach. The doiches Shabbos Tumah. It certainly overrides the Shabbos and it overrides the Tumah. The Oisa Tamura, the carbon Yachidu, and it can affect Tamura because it's a private offering. But right away there's a problem. Why does it doiches Tumah? Because Tumah is Hutra B'tzibur. Tumah is pushed off, is allowed in the community. When everybody is Tameh, nobody's Tameh. Which means that the carbon Pesach is not a private animal, a private offering. In fact, it's a communal offering. In other words, everybody brings its own carbon, right? But it's being done all together. So it's a communal. So the Gemara jumps on it. The Gemara jumps on it. Kesava ain't shoichtin Pesach ala yochid. We get out of it. Rav Sheshes says we don't slaughter a carbon Pesach on a single person. All carbon Pesachs need to have upon have to have other people registered upon it. Because here's the thing: the carbon Pesach is established in its time, b'moyadoi, in its time. So it must be brought even on Shabbos, even b'tomah. Nonetheless, as Pesach is unique, that if you're tameh, there's something called Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara, of course, asks, but nukli b'Pesach Sheni. So let Rav Sheshes say that we're dealing with Pesach Sheni. Pesach Sheni does not require two people on the carbon. It happens to be that you, the individual, were tamei, so you have to bring a Pesach Sheni a month later. Says the Gemara, mi doche tumei. Does the second Pesach override tamei? The only reason why you're bringing the Pesach Sheni is because you were tamei by Pesach Rishon back in Nisan. Now you're going to tell me. So we said, okay, we'll let you bring the Korban Pesach next month. But obviously, we want you to bring the Korban Pesach big Tahara. So therefore, the whole thing doesn't even apply. So this variety, in this opinion, that it does not. And therefore, Rav Sheshes does not wish to interpret the Brayso that it's talking about Pesach. Now, in fact, there's a machlokes whether Pesach Sheni de facto, that if, you're right, the whole reason why the Pesach Sheni was allowed to be brought because you were Tomei in the Pesach Rishon. So the Torah was enough to say you could bring it a month later. But what happens if you're Tomei a month later? So
that's it. You just got one chance.
Nah, well, not exactly. So Lamai says in all these cases, they say, no. Sit, yes, you were supposed to be tahar. You were supposed to be pure. You blew it again. We'd like you to bring the Korban Pesach anyways. So there is a start to say the Pesach Sheni, but that goes back to remind anybody in Psachim, Daf Nun Tes, Daf Tzadik Tes or Tzadik Aleph. What is the Pesach Sheni? Is it Tashlumin? Is it to be mashlemt? It allows us, if I didn't bring the first, I could bring the second. In other words, we said it with regard to Karis. If somebody deliberately doesn't bring the Pesach Rishon, is he Chayiv Karis or no? But because he can bring the Pesach Sheni, he's not Chayiv Karis until he doesn't bring the Pesach Sheni. If you remember vaguely that Mishnah, this applies over here too. We go further. Rav Huna said in the name of Rabbi Yeshua, the son of Rabbi Yeshua said it said to Rava, the Tana concerning the town of the previous Mishnah and Baraisa. Why does he differentiate between the Korban Pesach, which he calls a private Korban, and the Chagiga, if you remember in the Mishnah, which is called a Korban Siva, communal Korban? We asked this question. We said the Gemara is going to have to tackle it because the Chagiga is a Korban Simcha. You're bringing the Chagiga as your joyful offering that there should be more meat on the table. And if you don't bring it, the world does not come to an end. If you don't bring the Chagiga, whoop-de-doo. Okay, so you have less meat, but the world's not coming to an end. So what's going on over here? So do we say, really, it does not have the feel of a communal offering? It's not. So how could you tell me it is? If you're going to say it's brought in an assemblage, in other words, all the Jews who have gathered for the Shalosh Regalim, we're now on 51A2, heading down the Ovid. It's brought by all the Jews who come up to Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem for the Shalosh Regalim, for the three vegetables. I will say, Ka Pesach Nami Asim B'Chinifor. But Pesach is not either a Korban Yachid. It's also not a private offering because the Korban Pesach is brought by millions of people on Har Abayis, on Erev Pesach. So it too is also a community-wide thing. In other words, everybody shows up. Yes, they're all individuals bringing their individual components, but they're all coming together as one because today's the day. So says the Gemara, it's going to go right back to where we did it before. It could pay some shady, the loy has it pay some shady, which is not brought in the assembly. On the contrary, it's a bunch of yichidim, a bunch of individuals who are tamei or on a distant road. Right? I wonder, by the way, today when Mashiach comes, are we going to get away with saying we're on a distant road when you get on a plane and 10 hours later you're in America, you're in Eretz Yisrael? So that's going to be a question. But anyway, when Mashiach comes, there's never going to be a distant road anymore.
Doesn't matter. The Gemara says distant could be even if you're just outside of the Bis Mikdash.
So my father's answered correctly, that it's true. We won't get away with, I'm stuck in New York, I couldn't catch a flight. You should have booked the flight. But traffic has to be taken into consideration. You land in Ben Gurion, and the traffic between Ben Gurion to Yerushalayim is going to be so backed up by millions and millions and millions of people that, all right, you're off the hook. You'll have to hang out in Eretz Yisrael until ER. That's it. So that's what you're saying, Daddy. That you got stuck in traffic, in short.
All right.
That's what it is. That's what that is. Can't simply be hanging out. Now, Amalei says Rav Huna, forget about Pesach Sheni. Im Kain, Yehei Doiches and Shabbos is a Tumah. If so, the Pesach Sheni should override Shabbos and Tumah, right? And the Pashtus, I don't see that. What it called, and we know that the Pesach Sheni only overrides the Shabbos. That if your Dalit ER should be a Shabbos, you would bring it. But it does not override Tumah, according to this Yoma. According to this, if you are Tumah, you don't bring a Pesach Sheni. Amalei, yes. Kemad Yoma Dochi, yes. I'm going according to the Mandi Yoma that the Pesach Sheni overrides the Shabbos and the Tomei. That de facto, if you happen to be Tomei by Pesach Sheni, bring the Garban Eddie. The Tanya, Pesach Sheni Doiches a Shabbos, Be'ed Doiches a Tumah. Rabbi Yehuda Oima Af Doiches a Tumah. It is even Doicha the Tumah, that if you have to be Tumah, bring it. My Tama the Tanakama. What's the reasoning of the Tanakama that it pushes off Shabbos and doesn't push off the Tumah? Mipnei Tumah dichisu v'yasu b'Tumah. You deferred the first Pesach on Yud Nisan because of Tumah. You're now going to tell me, but okay, the second one could be done in Tumah? It's a perfectly logical explanation. Rabbi Yehuda Amalach L'chav, Rabbi Yehuda will say to you, but you forgot, we've got a pasuk. Like all the decrees of the first Pesach, you shall make it the second Pesach, the Pesach Sheni, which means afilu b'tumah, that sometimes it has to be done even in tumah. The Torah wanted a person to bring the Pesach in a state of tahara, in a state of purity. And therefore, he allowed the Tomei person to be deferred from Yud Dalet Nisan to Yud Dalet Iyar. Lo Zacha, but if a might say it doesn't work, and the guy is still Tomei for whatever reason, let him do it with Tomei. Let him offer it at least for Tomei, according to this Mandiyam. We're now on Amid Beis. Nun Aleph Amid Beis, we're going to the Mishnah. Here we go. So now we go back to Rabbi Elazar again said, is the Kohen Gadol's chatos, the bull of the Kohen Gadol, the chatos bull, the par Kohen Yom Kippur, is it a carbon yachid, a private offering, and his fellow kahanim are merely hanger-on, or no, since the fellow kahanim also get atonement, are also miskaper, they're considered shutfin partners, and therefore partners cannot affect Tamura. Says the Gemara, but typically the Asher Loi Amar Rachmana, regarding the Chatas bull, the bull of the Kohen Gadol, it says Asher Loi, his own, which means Mishaloi, who maybe the Kohen Gadol has to bring it from his own money, he's got to pay for it himself. The Tanya, because we learned in a Baraisa, Asher Loi, his own chatos, means Mishaloi, who maybe V'loi Mishal Tzibor. He has to bring it from his own pocket and not from the treasury of the community. He can't go to take from the shul's general fund. It might have thought that he should not bring it from the treasury of the community. Which the case of the thing would be from the Machzis shekels, right? Because the community itself is not mischapa, does not achieve atonement from it. Who's achieving atonement from the bull of the Kohen Gadol? The Kohen Gadol, his family, and his brothers Kahanim, but not the Kehillah at large, not Klal Yisrael at large. So they can't touch. You can't simply reach into the shekels, the machzah shekel to pay for the bull. So therefore, you're right. He cannot take from the general fund of Klal Yisrael, i.e., the machzah shekel, the lishcha, the shkolim, but he could go to his fellow brothers, Kahanim, and say, hey, you guys, I'm bringing this bull and I'm achieving atonement. I'm achieving kapara for you guys as well. So chip in. Because his brothers, Kahanim, are receiving atonement through him bringing it. Talmud Loim, therefore the pasuk says, Asheloi. It says it a second time. It actually says in that parsha, Asheloi 3 times. This is the second. Talmud Loi Asheloi, his own, meaning precluding only from his own money, and he cannot take any money from his brother's kahanim. Yochel lo yobi b'hevi kosher. But I might have thought this is only lechatchila initially. He has to bring from his own money. But if he does get money from his fellow kahanim, because they say we want a part of it, or he says, listen, guys, it's unfair, you're also getting an atonement. De facto, if that should happen, it would be an okay offering. Tamaloi Mashuv, a third time, Asheloi. Shana Kosama Loliakim. The Torah repeats it to make it essential, therefore, that it's his own. Therefore, if it's his own, Al Korchach, right? Al Korchach, what does that mean? That in fact, his private is, and the other Kahanim are clearly only hanger-ons. By the fact that the Kohen Gadol is their leader, and he is he's carrying them on his shoulders, or in the words of Rashi before, floating on top of the water, floating on top of the Kohen Gadol. That's
so you should be able to make Tamura.
They're not. But in fact, they're not own partners at all. It's a private ownership, and therefore it should be allowed a tamura like any private offering. So why was Rabbi Elazar having a question? It's obvious. Does the Gemara l'tamech? No. But according to your reason that the bull is only owned by the Kohen Gadol, Kahanim, concerning the brothers Kahanim, ilav de kanu b'gavei heichem echapalu. If they have no share, how could they be atoned? If they have no bylaws, if they have no ownership in this animal,
how can we get a kapura?
The Kohen Gadol happens to say, me, my family, my fellow Kohanim, very nice. But the fellow Kohanim are not on the animal. So what's going on? Elo, Shani, Be, Gaza, Diaret. You have to concede that are the Kohen Gadol's ownership, Aaron being the first Kohen Gadol, but meaning the Kohen Gadol's ownership of the bull is different than ordinary ownership. The Ikri Rachmon Gabi Ochiv HaKayanim.
The Afgare.
The Torah is essentially the Afgare. I'm sorry, Rachmon Gabi Ochiv HaKayanim. That the Torah HaKadosh Baruch Hu is essentially declaring it ownerless, hefker. It's saying it's hefker, it's ownerless with respect to his fellow Kohanim, and considers them therefore partners, even though he bought it with his own money and they contributed nothing. Essentially, he's buying it. He's saying, I'm asking for kapara for myself and my family. And then the Torah says, oops, right now, now it becomes ownerless. And the other Kohanim are allowed to jump in and grab it and say, oh, we're joining it on the atonement. But here regarding Gabi Tamura, Nami, with regard to Tamura,
it's like Marxism.
You
pay and the other guy takes.
Socialism, right. You pay for it, but I own it. Right. Everybody's equal as long as you're paying the bill. But of course, Daddy, we could talk like that because we're in New York. But this Shia is taking place in the wonderful state of
Boca Raton.
They do not think that way. They have no income tax. You only pay for what you use. That's it. And you don't scrounge on other people's money. Right?
Yeah.
So why are we still in New York? I don't know. Anyway, Here too, with regard to the laws of Tamura as well, I can say, Shani Gay Gaza the Aaron, the Kohen Gadol's ownership of the bull is different than regular ownership. The Afkare Rachmana Gabi Achibakahan. That the Torah considers ownerless with respect to the Kohanim. So therefore, now we have an inquiry. Does the Torah actually, are we saying that the Torah is rewarding full partnership ownership in the bull, and therefore there's plenty of partners on this bull because of the Torah is essentially making it hefker ownerless regarding the atonement, having them join on the atonement, and therefore you can't make it tabura because it's not owned by an individual, I think. Or no, we're saying once again, it's ancillary. The truth is, it's the Kohen Gadol. Of course, it's the Kohen Gadol. The Torah is allowing us to be, the Kohen Gadol is the representative of all the Kahanim. So by definition, we're schlepping this along. Since it's unclear, that's why Rabbi Elazar posed the question. Very good, everybody. We got to the Mishnah.